My name is Ray, and I live and work in Melbourne, Australia, which is down under. Like we're right at the bottom of Australia. It's a great city. I'm born and bred here. Absolutely love it. I work with young men and boys. I've always had a real interest in that. I've been a teacher in various guises for, 25, 30 years. A big part of my work has been with boys and raising the kind of healthy boys that we need for this age. I work in a boys' school, and as part of that work, I have a research role, researching, sort of societal factors, what constitutes how we raise kids, work with parents. I do a little bit of teaching, and I have a few side hustles, and the side hustles are things like I work a little bit in theatre, and I've got a show coming out later this year, which I'm really excited about, which is also about masculinities and, how I guess the culture that we find ourselves in, and also, some of the biological influences, I guess, sort of shape us. But probably like a lot of people, Camille, like I'm quite concerned about, the messages that our kids get, particularly our boys, the environment, in terms of our culture that we find, that they find themselves in, and making sure that we've got some, positive stories and ways of reinforcing the kinds of hopes and aspirations that the kids that I work with, that I see every day. I mean, they're beautiful people, but I'm not always sure that we're giving them the right, the right medicine, the right sort of sustenance that they need. So that's a little bit about me.
Okay. And you also have your podcast. You want to just say quickly?
I do. Yeah, absolutely. So, so we have a podcast. It's in its 4th season. It's called Understanding Boys. And we talk to people from different walks of life about really those two things. What is it to be a good man these days? And people have answered that in all sorts of different ways and contexts. Everything from what is to be a good person these days to what are some of the gender specific challenges that the boys and young men face. And we also have a question, which is, if you had a story that you could tell a boy of 14 and he'd listen, what would the story be? You've got people reflecting on their own, early adolescence. It seems to be fairly seminal in how, in shaping their characters and their values. They're going to go from that kingdom of childhood, and they're sort of walking out into the world around about that age. And there's a lot of really interesting sort of pivot stories around about that time.
So what have you learned from that experience in terms of like the right medicine or the messaging? Like if you were to kind of look at it as a whole, what would you think is the most damaging messaging, and what do you think the alternative is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in summary, one of the things that I think we can see quite clearly is the sorts of choices that the kids are making, from quite a young age. And I know you've spoken with Judy, from Stanford about her work and her book, When Boys Became Boys. That was a really big book for me because it voiced a lot of concerns that I had, but also concerns that have been flushed out in the podcast. Essentially, her thesis, as I understand it anyway, is that kids are really young, and 4 and 5, they're already starting to make decisions about the kind of way they want to represent themselves. And not all of those representations are healthy. So they start to cut out their relational connectedness, if you like, because they see through story, through film, through the internet, through everything else, kind of reinforced dominant messaging about to be healthy, to be successful in life, you need to actually be alone, you need to be strong, you need to be stoic. And that gets really problematized because actually sometimes you do need to be strong and you do need to be stoic. Like it's not 100% wrong.
Right.
We don't want people who can't, who don't have any backbone. Like we need that, right? But what happens to boys is that they shut that out. And then if you imagine through time, from that young age, from 4 all the way, just say we take it to that 14-year-old point, they're not only shutting out like the vulnerability, their close connections, but they're also shutting out like their experience of language and how to name the various emotions that they feel, the nuances around our own emotional expression. And so is it any wonder that we get these 14-year-olds who grunt? They don't have the words.
Like, I don't have any words.
Yeah, so, and there may be other reasons for the onset of monosyllabism, but I think about these kids that are, and they're not empty vessels. I mean, this is the thing that's really impactful, is that they're brimming actually with all of this unnamed, non-defined, scary. Imagine walking around and loving people, but not ever being able to say it. Like, I remember, having an intimate discussion with a kid when I was young. We would have been 9. I found him, he was crying, and I sat with him, and it was beautiful. But a week later, he kind of started being really different with me, and it was because I knew, it was never said, but I knew, and he knew, that I had been given this power over him because I had seen him as being vulnerable, and that made him weak.
Oh, wow.
So we actually could never be friends.
Oh, that's so
even
sad.
though, yeah, but I don't think that's an unusual male story. Again, recently, with a friend of mine, we surf a lot together, and we'd been out, at this thing, and we were coming back and from surfing, and
like a wave. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, I'm doing the wave. I'm just, I'll fully act it out. But I just remember the difficulty. I mean, this is like 2 weeks ago, right? The difficulty of just putting my hand on his shoulder and just saying, "That was great. I love you. I love you." And just even now, this trepidation. So, getting back to the podcast, I think
Wait,
that.
no, finish that thought.
Well, just the difficulty, I suppose.
What was that like? Did you do it?
No, I did it. Yeah, I did it. But I remember feeling like, oh, this felt a bit weird for me. Like, it was a part of my brain that had coded it that way, because that's the environment that I grew up in.
No, I understand that. But did it feel weird to you because it felt inappropriate, or did it feel like you were worried about being perceived as gay, or a power thing? Like, can you say what you think the weirdness was?
The weirdness was that it's an unusual way for a male,
yes,
in the company of another male and no one else,
yes,
to be intimate like that. That's how part of my brain coded it. I did it because it's not how I don't feel.
It's not who you are and what your values are.
It's not who I am. Yeah, it's not who I am, and it's not what I support. And I know differently. I guess the point I'm making is that I was just aware that even at my age, nearly 50, doing this kind of work for a long time with kids, and reading the books and everything else, and doing the therapy and everything else. Even still, everything else, right?
Yeah. Right.
But even still, I still felt a sense of that emotion, that being emotionally vulnerable with another male in that way, just felt it was part of my brain that kind of went, oh, I'm not sure.
Have you had a male friend be that way to you? And if you had any weird feelings about it, being on the receiving end?
Yeah, I'm really comfortable with it, and that's probably because a lot of the work that we do, particularly here, is through Dialogueic Circles, and practicing that, I guess, that emotional muscle, and developing those things. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, I have a group of old school friends that when we went to school back in the sort of 80s together, and what I've noticed in the last few dinners, we catch up for a dinner every now and again. We've got another one this weekend, actually, and I've noticed that it's become much more authentic. It's become much more real, and talking about partners, and talking about, children, if people have children, and these sorts of things. And that's been really refreshing. And it's been great because what unified the group of us was probably competition, because we all played sports together. And it was a very competitive environment that we were in. So it was in the context where our friendships was forged was not such that we were that emotionally connected in an overt way, but obviously we were, because here we are 30, 40 years later, and we're still all friends. I think it's changing. I think there's just still pockets. And I guess going back to the question about what's distilled and what's become clearer from the podcast is that these kids they go through that. They don't have the naming conventions, and they kind of arrive at 14 and then into their adolescence and into their adulthood. And is it any wonder they're going through that process that when they come out, there's some really sort of distorted behaviors at times. Kids they get pushed, they don't know how to respond. They can be really disrespectful. They can be, they don't have it named, their own, what is sometimes labeled as feminized feelings. And because they don't have that, they resent feminized expressions in other places. And so we've got a lot of work to do, in how we create the emotional safety for those things to happen, how we normalize things like help seeking, but also how we, how we have programs that actually facilitate healthier conversations and healthier dialogue. And we challenge some of the conventions. For instance, it's been something like 30 or 40 superhero films that have come out in the last sort of 7 or 8 years. And if we typify a lot of those films, and particularly the male characters in those films and the female representations as well, they really do reinforce. I don't know if it's really that healthy, this idea that you're a solo. Yeah.
I call bullshit.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, Kimmy. I'm trying to be diplomatic.
I get it.
It might be the the English part of me coming out or something, that kind of diplomacy,
For sure. And I meanwhile so inappropriate.
Yeah. But okay, let's call a spade, So, I mean, the idea that, to be successful, you're going to wake up and, kill a whole bunch of bad people and, maybe do one or two other things and sort of collapse in a drunken stupor. That's so much of what we see. It's so much of what our kids see.
Right.
It's just really not what they need.
Right.
There's so many other stories out there. Anyway.
I was going to say that goes to the other part of my question is, what do they need? Like, what's that medicine or that nourishment? And part of me thinks maybe part of the answer is something you mentioned that I wanted you to follow up more about. So maybe they will connect, are the circles that you were talking about. You mentioned the circles. I would love for you, is that part of something that's nourishing? I would think so.
Yeah, absolutely. So we learned this as a fellow in Australia called Arno Rubinstein. I learned this process from him. He's part of a general movement in rites of passage. And one of the things I learned from Arno was just the importance of just hearing stories from other people and from older people. You can be in a room, if you set it up right, so you're literally sitting in a circle, we just call them dialogic circles. And you can start with the prompts, and you've got the younger people there and the older people there. And so it might be, what's your relationship like to grief? And so the older people speak and no one interrupts. They just speak, and then the kids listen. And you can take the most distracted, the most kind of, out there kid and put them in a space like that where people are genuinely sharing, and they will just sit and listen. It's literally what they need. It is an incredible thing to do, and there's a bit to, how you set it up and how you create the safety, but it's also not that hard to do. And, taking time to actually honor and acknowledge people as well. One of the other processes that we use in these dialogic circles is about seeing people for who they are, their actual, sometimes the expression is their genius, who really are they? And you have these other people, again, adults, who are just confirming in the young person, hey, when I saw that about you, I love your sense of humor, Kimmy, you're such a human who is so available, you're real, you're genuine, I feel comfortable when I speak to you. And you're passionately driving change, and you're really committed, and I admire and respect your commitment. When you say an honoring like that in front of other people, you just let it sit. Wow, that is medicine for a kid who, for a boy who's probably may not have ever really had anybody see him before. And these aren't just boy specific things, obviously, but we're talking about the boy bit. So that they can be really, really powerful.
I guess the question is, what didn't you get as a kid? And did that inspire your work?
Yeah, I think probably a couple of things. So I had a really difficult relationship with my dad. That's probably front and center. And I'm trying to think, there's a lot around that sort of the wounds that we get as kids, right? And, you know, for me, you know, I felt really impacted by the disconnect that I had and still have, you know, with my own dad. And that was really, really difficult. And other stories, like, you know, the one I shared about the other boy who I loved but never could be close to after that, was another kind of seminal experience that just, like, I was sort of kid who would cry in a movie. You know, I remember when E.T., you know, flew home, you know. Oh, I was just dying. Like, it was so full on when E.T. went home, you know. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. There it is. You know, and I think, you know, when I was watching E.T. flying home and just aware, even as a kid, how impactful, and why was I upset? I wasn't, you know, but then I realized it was about all this loss that I felt, and I just never had the words. And then I started, I think, just getting really interested in that, and you know, why is it that we're, you know, as men, we don't speak about these things? You know, it felt strange to me and a bit alien. I also had a great relationship with my mum, who is and still is just an incredible person. She was a polio survivor, and extremely intelligent, and, you know, just really available, you know. And I think I could see how, yeah, I could just see that way of work. You could take her anywhere. She talked to anyone, you know, like, just in her way. She wasn't an extroverted person, but she just hop in, you know. She just hop into a chat, and
it kind of feels like you're describing you.
Yeah. Maybe, I hope so. But she was great, you know. And I think so. Some of those things definitely impacted. And then when in my early 20s, you know, I started working back with early life stuff, you know, and there's some things in that early life, you know, for me that were really traumatic, you know, around boundaries and around, you know, who I was, and that sense of, you know, that of my being a sovereign of my own body, you know, and that was, that had been really impacted. And so there was a process around that I needed to reconcile, which is it's been an ongoing process, but I could start to see how some of these modalities and things were really helping me and finding the words, and then through stories and dreams, how that was all sort of coming together. And so as a teacher, and then a researcher, and then a theatre maker, like, it just seemed to make sense that, you know, particularly with the work that I'm doing now, it's kind of come together in this way. And so, yeah, the podcast and the book coming, little things like that, it just seems to be, you know, just bit by bit, it's all starting to make sense. And that's where the passion comes from.
Right. And I was going to say that it's interesting. You talked about what you're giving the kids now, which is the words, right? The stories and the words and the narratives and the normalizing that you didn't have. And so that's really cool. It's kind of like how we parent the way we wish we were parented. So do you feel like I know you happen to have a son and you have a daughter too, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering your relationship with your son, if your relationship with your father also influenced your maybe availability or what you gave him in addition to all your students.
Yeah, I think it has. And, you know, one of the things, so Micah and I, so my son Micah, he's 19, about to turn 20, and he's beautiful kid, and absolutely, you know, like, I really wanted to be the best dad in the universe for Micah, and, you know, because you know, like, it's just quest and everything. I don't know that I have been the best dad in the universe. I think, because of course, you know, when we come out, if we're being reactive to things, you know, we need to check that, you know, because there's a lot of stuff that he doesn't need from me that I needed, you know, because I didn't get it, but he did.
Right.
You know, so you can pretty quickly get into this sort of, you know, this territory where, you know, I'm trying to, like, you know, a good example was when we did this, we did a rite of passage program, and I did it as a participant. I do them as a facilitator and leader, but I did one as a dad with him. And in one of the moments in the rite of passage, the way it works is that there's an opportunity for the young man to tell, the mentor or his dad or his mum or whoever's with him, to tell them one thing, like, I need you to stop doing this. And the idea is it's a bit of a stepping into adulthood. And what my son said to me was, Dad, you need to stop trying to make everything right, and like for me, in the way that I grew up, with my dad, there was a lot around, my perspective on it anyway was that, there was a lot of kind of control and, things being said that weren't, and I just never really knew what was right, which way was up, that was my experience. And, with my boy, I was always like, let's be really super clear. Let's be, let's work everything out. Let's just have no issues ever. Let's have the difficult conversations,
all the time, right?
Like the poor kid, he's had that many authentic conversations. So his message to me was, Dad, enough. Like, it's okay for things to be a bit, it doesn't have to be perfect all the time. Like, we're going to disagree.
Right.
And sometimes I don't want to have to work it out. I just I don't want to work it out. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it does.
It is funny too, because what you just said reminded me of something Milo says. He'll be like, something happened at school. And I'll say, okay, do you want to talk about it? He'll be like, is it going to become a big conversation?
What level?
So similarly, I've had to learn, like, it doesn't have to be, like, it doesn't have to be, right?
Totally. And they talk about, particularly in teaching, one of the keys to successful classroom management is actually tactically ignoring certain things, because you can't, you can't do every little thing, like some things are just annoying, like, it's just going to be annoying. It's a little stone in your shoe, and you're just going to have to, you got to pick your battles. You get 3 cards. Which one are you going to play? You're going to play a big card on, the dishwasher's not unpacked, or you're going to leave it for, something that really matters.
Do you have overall parenting advice for parents with young boys in terms of, like, what they can do differently to create a different boyhood, to create a different culture, to create different messaging?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. There's the great psychologist, Winnicott, who talks about being the good enough parent, and the good enough parent is, it's love, home, and all the other things probably don't make as much of a difference, but we tend to put a lot of time into, is he doing the karate lesson or this or that or the other? But actually the fundamentals of, how to be as a human being are really important. I think around that, there's a few key things in the early years that kids need to learn and boys need to learn. One of them is about boundaries and rules. And it's really important that kids start to understand the connection between behaviors and outcomes gently, but clearly, so they need that sense of, where things are, what happens, that there are consequences. And I think sometimes with modern parenting, we're very big on the relational side, which I'll come to, but it's very, very important. We also need kids, and particularly boys, to form good relationships to how they understand the rules of the game. That life has a series of referees, and that actually it's important that we make a relationship to that part of us, because I think, because it leads ultimately to things around, self-regulation. It leads to, it's one of the executive functions, that kids can actually be socialized like that. I think that is really important. I think it's really important for boys because we live in a world of technology where there aren't very many stop cues. And so for kids, for boys to be able to move towards self-regulation, obviously not going to in the early years, they need help with that, but they also need consequences and boundaries. And I know it sounds a bit old-fashioned, but I really think it is actually really important. It leads on to things about, consent and, how you treat others and, all of those sorts of things. It starts with, what's, no means no, and it goes both ways, so if a child doesn't want to be tickled, don't tickle
Right.
You know, like you know, that understanding, okay, there's a boundary here. That's an important thing to get a sense of. But equally, when we talk about the relational stuff, you know, the role of the alongside, you know, helping to name what's going on, you know, helping to, you know, have routines and rituals where we eat together. Again, the formality around, you know, things at the table and, you know, how we do all that, I think is important. You know, I think it helps to create the cues that enable kids and boys to kind of know where they are, you know, referentially. I think that's also really important. I think generally parents, guardians are doing a lot of outward looking in the modern world. You know, we need to, you know, we're doing our careers, we're doing our I think in the home life, in those developmental years, we need someone paying attention to the inner nature of what's going on in the home world, in the home life, you know, so that someone's actually paying attention to that. Doesn't have to be mom, it doesn't, you know, it's a shared thing. It's just that it needs to happen. I think
and that goes, that connects with the consequences, because you're saying like, okay, all feelings are normal, but not all behaviors, you know, okay.
Yeah, acceptable. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
In the Buddhist framework, you might talk about it as noticing.
Yes.
You know, just noticing and just aware of how you're responding, you know, to things. I mean, a great example to me was we ran a webinar on teens and technology through the Crowther Centre where I work, and we're in part of the preparation, my colleague and I were looking at old James Bond films and just looking at like the treatment, you know, of women in those James Bond films, and they're films that I'd seen, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but I probably didn't even notice the extent, you know, the extent. But you look at it with modern eyes, you're like, oh, wow. So, you know, it's just about it's.
Did you ever see The Breakfast Club?
Yeah.
Okay, so that has a shot of her underwear, like underneath the desk, in between her legs, and the camera goes on a shot, and you're like, I didn't notice that at all as a thing, and I'm horrified now. Yeah.
It's a good example. So it's just about noticing those things, because we're not going to solve them in one deep, you know, Paul Micah's deep conversation with dad. But what it says is that, as much as anything else, it says that I'm growing up in a space where how people are treated, you know, that people aren't objectified, that we're aware of. They may not even be able to name it. And you look at someone like, you know, Piaget's work on how people understand, you know, start to understand it. You know, people can understand things before they can describe them. You know, so if you're growing up in a family where this is just how we're doing it, it's the rituals, it's the, and I know for some there's, you know, that's a problematized word potentially, but I guess the way in which we are as a family and what we talk about and how we talk, and the parents or parent or guardian, whoever's at home with that adult responsibility, is noticing what's going on. I just think it's a really important thing just to check in with. And it might be something as simple as, you know, a weekly check-in with yourself. And I guess that would be my last bit of parenting advice, which is, you know, parenting is really, really hard. Like, it's really hard. It's really humbling. I feel like I'm failing all the time. I'm also not a parent for very long for each stage. So I always feel like, I just had primary school kids. I could do that again. I would nail it next time. You know what I mean? I would nail it. Like, if you give me my son's adolescence back, I would nail it this time.
He's so good. Right?
You know what I mean? But when you're in it, the other thing that happens, I reckon, is you feel like this is it. This is my life. You know, like, I've got these kids and they're always crying, and you just think, oh, you know, but it goes so quickly. You know, people say that, but, you know, I just think, you know, when you're in a plane, and as the old saying goes, you're in a plane and the oxygen drops, you give it to yourself first. You know, like, as a parent, the role player, you know, in that, you've got to look after yourself, because if you're not looking after yourself, it's going to turn up in the relationships of those that you care most, to our point before, you're going to care most about and most intimately with. They're going to be your kids and your partner or whoever's there.
Yeah.
So yeah, paying attention to that, and give yourself, go back to the Winnicott comment about the good enough parent. You know, love goes, you know, it's not everything, but it goes a long way, you know, and being loving yourself and that self-care and self-kindness goes a long way. I was listening to a talk. I do a lot of mindfulness practice in one of those forms being metta, and which is loving kindness.
I love that, yeah.
Yeah, and it's great. When you think about what loving kindness does, not only because you're wishing others well, but then that in turn starts to wish you well, but what it does for your mindset, like in terms of your mindset and how you approach things. If you got up every day, you did your mindfulness, you did metta, and then you also asked a powerful question like, what's the best I can be today? It doesn't mean you have to be number one. It might be, well, actually, I'm run down, I'm cold, I'm tired, I'm this, I'm that. The best I can do is this, it's going to be baked beans. Do you guys have baked beans?
Yeah, what is that?
Okay, so like in Australia, we have baked beans on toast. It's kind of like
okay.
I don't know what that would be in the States, but but it's basically a can over baked beans on toast for dinner. Like that might be the best it's going to happen today. But just
right.
knowing that as a question, what's the best that I can be today? What's one negative thought I want to be aware of today? And the negative thought is this is going to last forever. Okay, when that comes up, I'm just going to leave it because I know that it's okay. I can look after it's going to be fine.
Right.
Just coming back to that kindness, coming back to that sense of perspective where we can be really great.
And also, if you're doing that work, Ray, you're modeling it, right? You're not just modeling, you're like living your values. So I think that's really important. One thing I'll say though is, I think you had said a comment on the BUB curriculum. You said, you're asking parents, because there are a lot of writing prompts, there are exercises to do. It's really challenging, right? Like no one wants to admit they're racist, or they don't want to admit they're sexist, or they don't want to admit, like the moment you admitted being with your friend after surfing, that it was awkward, like especially with the work you do, right? You wouldn't really want to admit that and have it be public, but like doing that is like your value. And so I guess my question is, how do parents, if they haven't been in therapy, if they haven't been introspective, if they are in an abusive marriage, if they can't pay their bills, if, they're so dysregulated, like, how do you do the things you're talking about? Just because I feel like even setting the table or having rituals requires a kind of controlling of the chaos. And I'm just wondering, for people who feel so immersed or enmeshed in the chaos, like how to necessarily know that it's really crucial to do and how to take a step towards doing that.
Yeah. I guess I would have to go back to the time in my life where, things were really chaotic and, where I felt I was completely out of control and, where to. And at that point in my life, I wasn't a parent, so I don't have a lived experience from which I can really answer that question. And I'm conscious of, all the things that go around, the privileges around that I haven't had that experience. But I have had the experience of living in a really chaotic, completely dysfunctional way in my early 20s. And, I guess the only thing I could say to that would be, and it's the Goethe thing about, just starting, like just take one thing, what's one thing, can you do one thing and what could that be? And if you can do that and sustain it, for a period, can you do it for a few days? Can you then do something else? I just think that, again, it's very present in a lot of iconography and mythology and stories. It's just that thing of lifting your, lift up your eyes, lift up your hearts, as painful as it is, and as full of doubt it is, because normally when we do one thing, it feels like nothing. It's like, what's the point?
Right.
But, coming back to that, what's one thing, and trying to, working towards that, getting back onto that inner sword, that inner strength is absolutely part of it. And then we think about, who might come and help, because sometimes people are around us that we don't always acknowledge that actually are the helpers, and being, again, it's a huge risk for some people, like it's the last thing you want to do is to invite someone into your chaos. sometimes, but actually being aware of the helper, and the helper might just be someone who smiles at you in the shopping aisle. That's the one thing, but hold on to that, like that's the beautiful moment of humanity. I remember my son nearly died when he was a kid. He had this horrendous, thing with his breathing, and it was just the most, anyway, I went outside and I just stood outside, and it was just this, it was so, it's Melbourne, it's down under, it's rainy, it's grey. And there's this one bird in the tree, and it's just like, it's this one moment, I'm just holding on, like just hold fast, Can you just hold fast to that moment? Can you lift up your eyes? Can you take one step? Can you do one thing?
I'm crying.
No,
I don't know, Ray. I don't know if I can do that.
You can, Kimmy. Let's do it together. But I know it's hard, and like I said, I'm not speaking from a lived experience of, being a single person, single mum, living in an abusive domestic situation, although as a parent, it was part of my youth was being in that. And when I think about that experience, I would say it was definitely those small moments of coming together and that warmth, that, just a hug or holding someone's hand, just those little things, and I think another thing that I've found helpful in those times is that sometimes it's like it's 24 hours of black, or darkness or whatever, and then that might happen, but then maybe one day there's just one moment, and then maybe a few more days there's two moments and three, and these are just these little stepping stones, through the darkness, and just being aware of, can we do that? Because people are tremendously resilient. As a therapist once said to me, you're stronger than the strongest blow you've ever received. Like if you're still here, you're strong.
Yes.
So that was a great comfort to me at different times.
Right. And to know that work is worth doing, and you can do it on a very massive scale, like being in intense therapy, and you can do it on a little scale, like saying to a bird, right?
Yeah, that's right. The bird that saved my life.
It's the name of your memoir.
That's right, yeah. From one bird to another. There's an everyday beauty about people that is all around us. If we can find a way to turn on our radar to that, you will be surprised, as C.S. Lewis wrote once in his book, we'll be surprised by joy. Like it's actually, there's beautiful people around us, and they're looking at us and they're smiling at us, and sometimes they let us in the queue, and sometimes they give us the last, we had a toilet paper shortage here during COVID. Sometimes they'll give us the last roll of toilet paper. And then, as you said, there's an invitation for us to be someone who just decides to smile more.
Yeah.
Yeah.